The air in the U.S. consulate in Benghazi was thick with the lazy heat of a North African afternoon and the cloying sweetness of jasmine from the courtyard gardens. It was a place of carefully managed tensions, a tiny island of American bureaucracy in a sea of revolutionary uncertainty. Within this bubble, Elena Vance was a study in deliberate unobtrusiveness. As a mid-level cultural advisor for the State Department, her official role was to smooth the edges of diplomatic friction, to understand the subtle nuances of tribal politics that were lost on her more senior colleagues. She was quiet, with a placid, observant face and a tendency to dress in muted grays and blues that allowed her to blend into the background of any room. She was, by all appearances, the quintessential bureaucrat, intelligent, harmless, and utterly unremarkable. No one ever noticed her, not really. She was just Elena, the woman who spoke flawless Arabic and 3 local dialects, who could procure a meeting with a reclusive sheik when no one else could. To the small SEAL security team temporarily assigned to the consulate, led by the formidable Master Chief Alex Thorne, she was another piece of civilian cargo to be managed. Thorne, a man whose features seemed to have been chiseled from granite and disapproval, saw her as the living embodiment of the soft, vulnerable world he was tasked to protect from the hard realities he knew. His men were ghosts of a different sort, moving through the consulate with a quiet, lethal confidence, their eyes constantly scanning, their presence a low hum of controlled violence beneath the veneer of diplomacy. They treated Elena with a detached, professional courtesy that bordered on condescension, holding doors for her and calling her ma'am, in a way that subtly underlined her status as an outsider, a fragile thing in a world of wolves. She accepted their behavior with the same placid calm she applied to everything, her faint, polite smiles revealing nothing of the person behind them. The placid rhythm of the afternoon was shattered by the sound of a crump, a deep, percussive explosion from the direction of the main gate that was too loud and too close to be a car backfiring. It was the sound of a world breaking. Before the last echo of the blast had faded, it was answered by a new sound, a ripping, metallic noise that Thorne and his men instantly recognized, the high cycle rate of a DSHK heavy machine gun. A second later, the consulate's alarms began to shriek, a frantic, electronic scream that signaled the end of diplomacy and the beginning of a war. Thorne was already moving, his body reacting with the fluid instinct of 2 decades spent in the crucible of combat. Contact front. All stations, lockdown procedures. Go, go, go. He barked into his wrist-mounted radio, his voice a blade of pure command that cut through the initial shock and confusion. His SEALs, models of lethal efficiency, moved to their pre-assigned defensive positions, their casual demeanor vanishing to be replaced by a cold, predatory focus. The consulate staff, caught in a whirlwind of panic, scrambled for cover. Elena, however, did not scramble. As chaos erupted around her, she moved with a calm, deliberate purpose, her eyes not wide with fear but narrowed in assessment, tracking the angles of the incoming fire, her head tilted as if she were listening to a complex piece of music. She followed the SEAL's shouted instructions, moving toward the designated safe room in the central building, but her movements were different from the other civilians. There was no panic in her stride, only a controlled, efficient economy of motion. Thorne noticed it peripherally, a flicker of incongruous calm in the storm, but he dismissed it as the dissociative shock that sometimes gripped people in moments of extreme terror. His priority was his men, the defensible positions, and the fragile civilian lives, including hers, that had suddenly become his absolute responsibility. The consulate was a death trap. The attackers were not a disorganized mob. They were a disciplined, well-equipped force that moved with military precision. They had planned this assault meticulously, using the surrounding apartment blocks as firing positions to create a perfect, inescapable kill zone. The local Libyan security forces, who were supposed to be the first line of defense, had either fled at the first shot or had turned their weapons on the consulate themselves. The SEALs were on their own, a handful of elite warriors against a small army. Thorne orchestrated the defense from the Tactical Operations Center, a hardened room now serving as their fortress. He directed his men with terse, clipped commands, shifting them from one crumbling defensive position to another, trying to counter the enemy's relentless pressure. They were falling back, room by room, corridor by corridor, trading space for time. Time for a rescue that might never come. Elena was with them, huddled in the relative safety of the TOC with the few other surviving diplomatic staff. Thorne had assigned one of his younger SEALs, a petty officer named Diaz, to guard them specifically. Thorne watched her for a moment on one of the security feeds. While the others were weeping or praying, she was sitting perfectly still, her back straight, her hands resting on her knees. Her eyes were closed, and her breathing was slow and even, as if she were in deep meditation. The sight was so bizarre, so out of place, that it angered him. It was the calm of someone who didn't understand the gravity of their situation, the ignorant bliss of a civilian who had no concept of the violent death that was clawing at the walls just feet away. The building shook as another RPG slammed into the facade, showering a nearby corridor with plaster and smoke. Thorne knew they couldn't hold the main building for much longer. Their only viable option was the annex, a separate, more fortified structure 100 yards across an open courtyard. 100 yards of open, unsheltered ground that was now a shooting gallery. It was a suicidal run, but staying put was also a death sentence. He had to make a choice. He had to get these people, including the strangely placid woman in gray, across that courtyard. The decision was made. They would make a run for the annex under the cover of smoke and suppressing fire. It was a desperate, high-risk maneuver, a break contact drill designed for soldiers, not for terrified diplomats. Thorne gathered the small group of civilians, his voice hard and uncompromising. "Listen to me, and you might live," he began, his eyes locking onto each of them. "We are moving in 60 seconds. We run. We do not stop. We do not slow down. We do not look back. If someone falls, you keep running. Am I understood?" They all nodded, their faces pale with terror. All except Elena. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable. Thorne grabbed her arm, his grip firm. "That includes you, ma'am. No matter what happens, you run." As they prepared for the run, setting smoke grenades by the exit, a fresh wave of assault came from the attackers. A team had breached the western side of the building and was now advancing down the main hall. An intense, close-quarters firefight erupted. An RPG detonated in the hallway, the blast funneling down the corridor with a deafening roar. The concussion wave threw everyone in the TOC against the far wall. Thorne was momentarily stunned, his ears ringing. He shook his head to clear it and saw that Elena had been thrown against a damaged piece of equipment. A jagged piece of metal had sliced her forearm, tearing the sleeve of her gray blazer and opening a long, shallow gash. Blood, dark and shockingly red, welled from the wound. She looked at it with a detached curiosity, then reached over with her other hand to apply pressure, her movements clinical and sure. As she pushed the torn fabric away from the wound, Thorne saw it. And the world stopped. On the pale skin of her inner wrist, revealed for a fraction of a second, was a mark. It was a small, simple tattoo, inked in a stark, black pigment that seemed to absorb the light. It was a stylized raven, its wings swept back, its head cocked as if listening. And in the center of its head, a single, tiny speck of blood-red ink formed its eye. It was a symbol that didn't exist. A symbol that was whispered about in the darkest corners of the intelligence community, a ghost story told to frighten new recruits at the CIA's farm. It was a myth. It was impossible. But it was there, on her wrist. The roar of the firefight just outside the door, the screams of the wounded, the smell of cordite and burning plaster. It all faded into a distant, muffled hum. Master Chief Alex Thorne, a man who had faced down death in a dozen countries, a man who had never frozen in a fight, was completely paralyzed. His mind, usually a whirlwind of tactical calculations, was a dead calm of absolute, bone-deep shock. The mark of the raven. His blood, which had been pumping with adrenaline just a moment before, seemed to turn to ice water in his veins. He stared at the tattoo, then at her face, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw the quietness not as passivity, but as stillness. He saw the observant eyes not as curious, but as assessing. The unassuming bureaucrat was a lie, a perfect, carefully constructed piece of camouflage. His men, seeing their leader frozen, his face a pale mask, were confused. "Master Chief, are you hit?" Diaz shouted, moving to his side. Thorne didn't hear him. He was lost in the chasm that had just opened up in his reality. The legends were true. The Knackjagger, the Night Hunters. A deniable ops unit so secret they were run out of a black budget that didn't even officially exist. They weren't soldiers. They were the intelligence community's internal affairs, their executioners. They were sent to hunt and eliminate rogue agents, traitors, and spies. They were the ones who cleaned up the messes no one else could. The reason why certain intelligence failures and political scandals simply vanished from the history books. They were officially disbanded after the Vienna incident a decade ago, an operation that had gone disastrously public and nearly toppled the government. Everyone involved was listed as either killed in action or had simply disappeared. This woman, this quiet cultural advisor, was not just a survivor. She was a ghost walking in the daylight. And he, a Master Chief of the United States Navy SEALs, had been treating her like a damsel in distress, telling her to run and hide. The sheer, cosmic irony of it was so profound it was almost comical. He had brought a knife to a gunfight, only to discover the person he was trying to protect was a nuclear bomb. Elena saw the recognition in his eyes. She saw the shock, the dawning horror and understanding. Her own expression flickered for a fraction of a second, a hint of something, annoyance, perhaps, that her cover was blown. Then, it was gone, replaced by the same unnerving calm. But it was a different kind of calm now. It was not the placid stillness of a pond. It was the cold, focused stillness of a predator that has just spotted its prey. The building shook again as the attackers used a breaching charge on the door to the outer corridor. The time for shock was over. Before Thorne could even begin to process the new reality, Elena took command. Her voice, when she spoke, was not the soft, polite tone of a diplomat. It was a low, resonant alto, stripped of all emotion, a voice that carried an authority that was absolute. "They've breached the hall," she said, not to anyone in particular, but as a statement of fact. "They'll be through that door in 10 seconds. They'll throw flashbangs first, then enter in a three-man stack. The point man will go right. The next two will clear left." Her tactical assessment was instantaneous, flawless. She looked at Thorne, her gaze direct and piercing. "Master Chief, give me your sidearm. Now." It was not a request. Thorne, acting on an instinct deeper than training, on the primal recognition of a superior predator, unholstered his Sig Sauer P226 and handed it to her without a word. She took it, her grip perfect, her movements economical. She checked the magazine, chambered a round, and flicked the safety off in one fluid motion. She then turned to his stunned men. "Diaz, Ramirez, set up a fatal funnel at that doorway. Do not engage until they are all the way in the room. You," she said, pointing to another SEAL, "cover the windows. They'll have a sniper providing overwatch from the building opposite. The rest of you, get the civilians into the server room. The walls are reinforced." The SEALs, warriors who took orders only from their own kind, looked from her to their frozen Master Chief. Thorne finally found his voice, a choked rasp. "Do what she says," he commanded. "Do exactly what she says." The TOC door splintered inwards with a deafening crash. Just as Elena had predicted, 2 flashbang grenades skittered across the floor, detonating with blinding white flashes and ear-splitting cracks. The SEALs, momentarily disoriented despite their training, staggered back. But Elena was already moving. She had turned her head and closed her eyes a fraction of a second before the detonation, her body reacting to the threat with an almost precognitive instinct. The moment the flash faded, she was on her feet. 3 armed men, clad in black, poured through the shattered doorway. They moved as a trained stack, just as she had said they would. The point man swung right. He never completed the motion. Elena fired twice, 2 tightly controlled shots to the center of his chest, the sound of Thorne's suppressed sidearm barely audible in the ringing aftermath of the grenades. The man collapsed without a sound. The other 2 attackers, seeing their point man fall, tried to bring their rifles to bear. They were too slow. Elena moved with a fluid, brutal grace that defied belief. She sidestepped, making herself a smaller target, and fired again. Another double tap, and the second attacker fell. The third, seeing the impossible unfolding before him, hesitated for a fatal half-second. Elena closed the distance between them in 2 quick steps. She didn't fire. Instead, she grabbed his rifle, twisted it, and used his own momentum to slam him into the wall. A single, precise strike with the butt of her pistol to his temple, and he crumpled to the floor, unconscious. The entire engagement had lasted less than 5 seconds. It was a display of close-quarters combat so fast, so efficient, so utterly lethal, that the SEALs who witnessed it could only stare in silent, slack-jawed awe. They were among the most highly trained special operators in the world, and they had just seen something that was not in any of their manuals. It was a different level of existence. Elena didn't pause to admire her work. She immediately ejected the half-spent magazine, slammed a fresh one from Thorne's belt into the pistol, and moved to the doorway, peering into the smoke-filled corridor. Her movements were a dance of deadly precision, a symphony of violence conducted by a master. In the ringing silence that followed the brutal, short-lived fight, the three SEALs in the room looked from the bodies on the floor to the quiet woman standing in the doorway. The spell of their shock was broken by Thorne, who finally found his voice again, though it was little more than a whisper. "The Raven of Vienna," he breathed, the name a piece of forbidden lore, a ghost story from the blackest archives of the intelligence world. He was referring to the legendary figure at the center of the incident that had supposedly disbanded the Jagger unit, a lone operative who had single-handedly eliminated a team of Mossad agents and Russian SVR operatives who were about to make a trade on Austrian soil, an act that had averted one crisis while nearly starting 3 others. The operative's identity had never been known, only their call sign, the Raven. Elena turned her head slightly, her eyes, cold and dark, meeting his. "They retired the call sign," she said flatly, which was not a denial. It was a confirmation of the highest order. She was not just a member of that mythical unit. She was its most famous, its most feared practitioner. The woman who had spent the past week discussing trade subsidies and cultural exchange programs was a living, breathing legend from the darkest corners of the shadow world. "The annex is a no-go," she stated, her focus already back on the tactical problem. "The courtyard is a kill zone. They know we'll try for it." She moved back into the room, her eyes scanning the architecture, the vents, the floor panels. "The old sub-basement," she said, looking at Thorne. "The blueprints showed a sealed access tunnel that connects to the old city's sewer system. Is it still viable?" Thorne was stunned by her knowledge. She had clearly memorized the consulate's blueprints, including its forgotten, sealed-off sections. "It was sealed with concrete a decade ago," he replied, his brain slowly beginning to function tactically again. "We don't have the tools to breach it." "We don't need to," Elena said. She pointed to the wall where the unconscious attacker lay. "They brought the tools for us. That breaching charge they used on the hall door. There should be another one on their breacher." She was already moving toward the man, her mind working 10 steps ahead of everyone else in the room. She was no longer a liability. She was their only hope. Under Elena's calm, precise direction, the dynamic in the room transformed. The SEALs, humbled and in awe, became her hands and feet. They were still elite warriors, but they now followed her lead without question, recognizing in her a level of tactical acumen that was beyond their own. They retrieved the unused, breaching charge from the enemy team, a block of C4 with a command detonation system. While 2 of them held the corridor, Elena led Thorne and the others to the sub-basement, a dark, forgotten space filled with old furniture and decaying diplomatic records. She ran her hand along a smooth section of the concrete wall, tapping it lightly. "Here," she said. "The tunnel is on the other side of this." She expertly affixed the breaching charge to the wall, her movements sure and practiced. She was as proficient with explosives as she was with a pistol. While she worked, she found the damaged communications console in the basement. It had been destroyed in the initial attack, its wires torn, its power supply dead. With a calm focus that was utterly mesmerizing, she began to repair it. She stripped wires with a small knife from a fallen attacker's belt, rerouted power from an emergency lighting circuit, and bypassed the fried central processor. It was a work of technical genius under extreme duress. Within minutes, the console flickered to life. She typed a single, long string of alphanumeric code into a command prompt, a secure burst transmission. It was not a distress call to the U.S. military. The address was a string of dead drops and encrypted relays that officially did not exist. "Who are you calling?" Thorne asked quietly. "Housekeeping," she replied without looking up, her fingers still flying across the keyboard. It was clear she was not calling for rescue from the military that had left them for dead. She was calling her own people. The cavalry was coming, but it would not be flying an American flag. The breaching charge created a perfect, contained hole in the concrete wall, revealing a dark, musty tunnel behind it. The sewer system. It was their escape route. As the last of the civilians and the SEALs scrambled into the tunnel, the sounds of the final, overwhelming enemy assault began above them. The attackers were pouring into the building, expecting to find them cornered. Instead, they would find an empty room and a handful of bodies. In the darkness of the sewer tunnel, guided by the dim red light of their helmet lamps, Elena led the way. She moved with a silent, confident grace, her pistol held at the ready, her senses attuned to the slightest sound. She was in her element now, a hunter in the night, a ghost moving through the forgotten spaces beneath a city. Hours later, they emerged into the pre-dawn light in a derelict warehouse district on the city's waterfront, miles from the burning consulate. Just as they stepped out of the sewer access, they heard the sound. It was the heavy, distinctive beat of Russian-made helicopter rotors. Two unmarked, matte black Mi-17 helicopters descended from the darkness, landing in a nearby clearing with no lights. The side doors slid open, revealing a team of silent, black-clad operators, their faces obscured by balaclavas, their weapons a mix of Western and Eastern European hardware. They were professionals, their movements economical and precise, just like hers. They formed a perimeter, their efficiency that of a well-oiled machine. One of them, clearly the leader, approached Elena and spoke to her in rapid, fluent Russian, his voice a low gravel. She replied in the same language, her tone that of a commander giving a report. She was no longer Elena Vance, the cultural advisor. She was someone else entirely, a figure of authority in a world Thorne could barely imagine. The leader nodded and then turned his gaze on Thorne and his SEALs. There was no warmth in his eyes, only a cold, professional assessment. Thorne understood. These were not allies. They were her associates, and he and his men were simply a package she had decided to deliver. Elena walked over to Thorne. The chaos was over. The adrenaline was fading, leaving only a profound, bone-deep exhaustion and the lingering shock of the night's revelations. "They will get you and your men to a safe extraction point," she said, her voice once again the quiet, neutral tone of the woman he had first met. "From there, your own people will take over." He looked at her, at the blood on her sleeve, at the quiet confidence in her eyes. "Thank you," was a wholly inadequate phrase for what she had done. She had not just saved their lives. She had shattered his understanding of the world. He settled for the only currency that mattered between warriors. He stood a little straighter and gave her a slow, deliberate nod, a silent, unambiguous gesture of respect from one apex predator to another. She held his gaze for a moment, then gave a slight nod in return, a silent acknowledgement. Then, she turned and walked toward the black helicopter, a ghost returning to the shadows, leaving Thorne and his men alone in the dawn, with an impossible story to tell.